In this unit, we're going to discuss the concept of fallacies in reasoning as well as sources of evidence. Let's start by discussing fallacies. Once you've identified the issues, conclusions, reasons, ambiguities, and assumptions, you'll have a solid base for evaluating whether the conclusions of the speaker or writer are appropriate. It's very common for fallacies or tricks in reasoning to be employed, though, so we're going to spend some time discussing these tricks and how they distort our perceptions of conclusions. Your authors give some very good examples of the three most common types of fallacies in general, which include providing reasoning that requires erroneous or incorrect assumptions, thus making it irrelevant to the conclusion, distracting us by making information seem relevant to the conclusion when it really isn't, and by providing support for the conclusion that depends on the conclusion already being true. So we're going to take a look more carefully or more closely about specific types of fallacies. So here we have a list of some of the most common types of fallacies. Some of them are more straightforward than others. So we're going to run through the list and I'll give you some examples related to speech pathology. You'll want to make sure that you complete the practice exercises in the book, as these are going to be very helpful in getting you to be able to identify fallacies more easily. So first we have reasons that attack a person rather than an idea. This is known as an ad hominem fallacy. So for example, if I said that the concept of a language acquisition device is ludicrous because Noam Chomsky, the person who put forth that concept, is arrogant and self-important, that personal attack on Noam Chomsky would not mean that the concept of a language acquisition device is necessarily false. Another fallacy is an appeal to emotions. In our speakeasy example, the writer said that people who stutter deserve to be heard. I might get the impression that people who stutter are marginalized and stereotyped, and so I might feel angry on behalf of people who stutter or sad for them. I might recommend the speakeasy to my clients simply because the writers played on my emotions, not on the basis of whether the product would be effective for my clients who stutter or not. Appeals to questionable authority occur all the time in our field, and one example of a questionable authority is Jenny McCarthy, who is an actress. She encourages parents to not vaccinate their children because she believes that vaccinations cause autism. We know that that's not true, but she, by virtue of her celebrity status, happens to be a authority to some people, even though she is a questionable authority to us as speech pathologists. Likewise, sometimes popular opinion is cited as a reason, when in fact popular opinion might not provide a good reason or provide much evidence. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's going to be effective or even morally right. For example, in the 1950s, it was a commonly held belief that autism was caused due to emotionally neglectful mothers. We know that's just not the case, but many people back in the day did not recognize the fallacy in this reasoning. Sometimes we may believe a conclusion because the reasons suggest that a perfect solution is impossible. An example would be that some researchers in fluency disorders believe that it's difficult or impossible to objectively measure changes in the attitudes and thoughts of people who stutter. They would say that because we can't perfectly measure thoughts and attitudes, we shouldn't address them in therapy. In other words, because a perfect solution is impossible, we should leave out attitudes and thoughts altogether from therapy. False dilemmas are also called either-or dilemmas, and in this type of fallacy, we may argue that there's only two options, when in fact many exist. So, for example, we might tell parents that the only effective treatment options for children with autism is ABA therapy or the Hannon program, when in fact there are other approaches to the disorder of autism. The planning fallacy occurs when people, groups, or organizations underestimate the time or resources needed to accomplish a task. This could happen in our field when you tell yourself you'll have time to prepare for a session between clients, but you end up unprepared due to a session running over, being interrupted by a colleague, having to take a phone call, and so forth. We have some more fallacies. The previous fallacies were pretty easy to identify, so we're going to move on to talking about some of the more complex ones. Slippery slope reasoning involves making the assumption that a proposed step is going to set off this uncontrollable chain of undesirable events, usually when procedures exist to prevent this sort of chain of events. So, for example, as a faculty member, I may be concerned when ASHA mandates standardized student learning objectives to universities. In this slippery slope scenario, I might protest that if ASHA can dictate these standards, they may also begin to dictate who we can admit to grad school and how I teach my courses. But in actuality, ASHA may put forth standardized learning objectives for students so that graduating clinicians are all equally capable in the field, but really ASHA doesn't have the authority to contradict university policies. Attacking a straw person means that the opponent's point of view is distorted so that it's easy to attack. In other words, we attack a point of view that does not truly exist. So obviously politicians do this all of the time. An example in speech-language pathology might be Medicaid reimbursement. We might hear that Congress is going to reduce speech and language benefits for our clients on Medicare, and if we wanted to use a straw person approach, we might say that the government hates poor people and wants to deny them so that they suffer, which in reality, that's not really the argument at all. Glittering generalities distract us by use of vague, emotional appealing virtue words that disposes to approve something without closely examining the reasons. The Northern Speech ad was a good example of this. Some of the words used were words like bestsellers and highly effective, and these words appeal to our sense of wanting the best for our clients. When we see words like this, we may be tempted to not investigate the product further before using it with our clients. A begging the question fallacy is an argument in which the conclusion is assumed in the reasoning. In other words, the reasons and the conclusions are the same. For example, if I said that it's important for children with speech and language disorders to receive therapy in school because therapy is an important part of the services that children with speech and language disorders receive in school, this would be a begging the question fallacy. I'm simply repeating both the reason and the conclusion. There's no difference between the two. Finally, we tend to introduce red herrings into our arguments in the hope that they will sidetrack our opponent. So let's say that you and a fellow classmate were doing a diagnostic and your supervisor brought you both together afterward to point out that a crucial piece of data during the parent interview wasn't collected. So note that the main issue at hand is the failure to collect a specific piece of data. So if you pointed out to your supervisor that your classmate wasn't very helpful and did less work than you, you would then be introducing a red herring. Let's move on now to a discussion of types of evidence and how we evaluate how good that evidence is. One common source of evidence for us in SLP is that of research studies. Factual claims made by authors or presenters are often located in the results and discussion sections, even if the researcher's assumptions aren't explicitly stated, although sometimes they will be. Factual claims are also found in the reasons researchers use to derive their conclusions. So when do we agree with factual claims? Well, obviously not all factual claims are false. We tend to agree with factual claims in three circumstances. Number one, when the factual claim is undisputed common knowledge. Two, when the claim is the conclusion from a well-reasoned argument. And number three, when the claim is adequately supported by solid evidence. In our field, we may not have a lot of things that all SLPs sort of universally agree on, except perhaps that SLPs provide important rehab services for people of all ages. but we tend to have lots of well-reasoned arguments, followed by somewhat fewer claims that are supported by solid research evidence. So let's attempt now to define what is meant by evidence. According to your textbook authors, evidence is explicit information shared by the communicator that is used to back up or justify the dependability of a factual claim. So in prescriptive arguments, in which someone is trying to tell us what ought to be, evidence is needed to support the reasons, and so the reasons are the factual claims. On the other hand, in descriptive arguments, in which someone is describing a situation, evidence will be needed to directly support a descriptive conclusion. So before we talk about types of evidence more specifically, I want to emphasize that as SLPs, it's our job to gather and analyze evidence to provide the best possible services for our clients. This use of evidence-based practice means that we need to be critical of the existing evidence and the sources from which this evidence comes. One widely cited definition of evidence-based practice is that it's the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individuals. When we begin to look at the evidence, we're going to run into many factual claims. Factual claims present conclusion as facts, when in reality we have to look very carefully at these claims. Some research and therapies are presented as facts, but we have to ask ourselves if the claim has evidence to support it and how good that evidence actually is. It's hard to establish the quote-unquote truth, but we do want to judge whether the evidence is dependable or not. So let's take a look at two types of evidence that we're going to encounter a lot as SLPs. The first is intuition. Intuition, or having a gut feel for the legitimacy of a conclusion, tends to work best when we find ourselves faced with common sense arguments. So if you tell me, for example, that SLPs often face burnout and feelings of being ineffectual in school settings because of their high caseload numbers, I would support your conclusion that the number of students on SLP's caseloads should be carefully monitored to make sure that the clinician can provide the best possible services to students. On the other hand, personal experience, it still comes up quite often in our clinical work. But if I was going to make this type of claim or provide this type of evidence, I might start by saying that in my experience, I have found, or I know someone who. And so these types of personal experience that are based on other evidence, such as research, could actually be really useful. But we have to be careful that we're not just relying on weak sense, critical thinking, to support our existing beliefs. Expert opinion also falls into the personal experience category, by the way. The hasty generalization fallacy is something we need to watch out for when using personal experience as evidence. This is something that will come up a lot and we have to be on guard for. The hasty generalization fallacy is a lot like stereotyping, in which a person draws conclusions about a large group of people based on their experiences with only a few members of that group. I might say, for example, that I'm going to use ABA therapy for all of my clients with autism because it worked so well for 2 of my clients. So I'm kind of overgeneralizing how effective therapy will be for all of my clients. Case examples are another type of evidence, and the danger with case examples in our field is that they take 1 or 2 clients and attempt to generalize them to the larger population. In this way, the types of therapy approaches that worked for a few clients can be overgeneralized, and clinicians assume that the therapy approach will work with all clients with that particular disorder. Sometimes the case examples that are portrayed are really extreme examples that might sway us with how dramatic the pre- and post-therapy results are. We see this all the time in weight loss commercials, the before and after picture of people who have lost a lot of weight on a specific weight loss program. But in our field, the Speakeasy was first introduced on Good Morning America, and the client who went from stuttering really severely to being perfectly fluent as soon as he put the speakeasy in, that was also a prime example of a very dramatic sort of before and after case example that managed to convince the general public that the speakeasy cured stuttering. So case examples can be dangerous in some ways if they are overgeneralized or the claims are too broadly made. Another type of evidence is appeals to authority. And obviously one of the authorities in our field is ASHA. So if someone tries to convince us of the effectiveness of a therapy approach by saying that ASHA recommends that approach as a best practice, we will generally find ASHA to be a persuasive authority and will probably agree with that person's reasoning. When someone appeals to an authority to make their argument, though, we need to ask ourselves if that authority is trustworthy, whether they make dependable claims, whether they're believable, etc. So with regard to ASHA, it's pretty common for us to say yes to these types of questions, but some evidence that we may encounter could come from other authorities with which we're less familiar. So in that case, we need to be very critical when we ask ourselves these questions of that organization or that person. Personal observations are another type of evidence that can be quite valuable. We obviously rely on our observations to collect our clinical data and our research data. If we have a standard observation procedure or protocol in place, and we can be fairly precise and unbiased, personal observations can be a really good source of evidence. But observations can be untrustworthy if we use selective memory or we're biased in some ways. In many cases, we may want our clients to succeed so much that we either inadvertently or even purposefully fail to note instances where the client was not successful. So I think our tick therapy is a good example of this. Often we may give the child the benefit of the doubt when they produce a sound that approximates the target sound but isn't 100% accurate. So in that way, our data collection or our observation was biased. Another type of evidence is that evidence that comes from research studies. So research studies, though, they come in a lot of different variations. And ideally, researchers are supposed to be able to collect and report their data in a way that's very controlled and replicable, meaning repeatable, and unbiased. But perfect research studies don't really exist, and research certainly varies a lot in quality. So all studies are going to have some deficiencies, and they need to be analyzed appropriately. In addition, research studies often contradict themselves. This is why one research study doesn't equal a proven fact. Instead, a single research study can provide relatively weak support for a conclusion, but if you have many research studies over time, this provides a stronger support for a particular conclusion. Research facts also change over time, and so we have to be careful that we're open to such changes and that we're not very closed-minded in terms of the one right way to do something. One of the biggest issues is that researchers do have a stake in their research. Everyone wants to be published, and most researchers have a hard time remaining neutral when they're making hypotheses about whether their treatment is effective or not. So that can really influence how you collect your data and even how you analyze your data. And finally, research might not have ecological validity, meaning that the research might not be generalizable to real life. So despite these problems with research studies, research can be one of our best sources for evidence. We have to ask ourselves a number of questions as we examine the research study to determine really how useful and how good it is, how much evidence it provides. So first we need to avoid the impossible certainty fallacy, and that's a fallacy that assumes that a research conclusion should be rejected if it's not absolutely certain. In all actuality, we know very few things with absolute certainty, let alone research. So after we've established that, making sure that we understand that nothing is certain with regard to research, we then need to ask ourselves about the quality of the paper. So was the research paper or article, was it published in a reputable journal? Was it peer-reviewed? So if you find an article that's just out there on the internet, but it wasn't necessarily published via a journal, that may send up a red flag. We want to know if it's organized well. Are there spelling or grammar mistakes? And we also want to make sure that the study discusses the strengths and limitations of the research study. All research is going to have limitations, and it's really important that the researchers acknowledge these weaknesses. We can also think about reasons why someone might distort their research findings. So, for example, when the Speakeasy was first promoted, all of the published research supporting its effectiveness came from its creators. So it should cross our minds as we read the study that the researchers, whether purposefully or not, might be biased as they want to sell a lot of these devices. We can also ask ourselves if the research was published fairly recently and whether the findings have been replicated by other researchers. Studies are stronger when the results have been replicated by independent researchers. With regard to the review of the literature, some researchers may present a very narrow or biased view of the previous research, and they may describe studies that present only one side of the issue. So again, that may send up some red flags for us with regard to the credibility of the evidence that's presented in that research article. Finally, we want to see some strong sense critical thinking, and we need to ask ourselves how much the study's design will contribute to whether it is successful or not, both in highly controlled conditions, but maybe even more importantly, in the real world. And here we have some other issues that can influence whether a research study provides good evidence. And first, generalization is a major factor. To generalize the results of a study to the larger population, the sample of participants has to be fairly large, must cover the characteristics of the larger population, be randomly gathered, and be repeated. These are actually a fair number of factors we must take into account before we can generalize to the larger population. It's also important to note that we can only generalize to like individuals, meaning that if the participants in my study had mild autism, I can't generalize my results to include all people with autism, because people in the general population will have a range of severities. Also, as we read studies, we have to keep an eye out for sources of bias or issues in the design that might unduly influence the results. In survey research, for example, we really want to analyze the survey items. Leading questions are often present that will bias the respondents. The same is true for studies that employ interviews or focus groups as a way to collect data. Finally, the use of analogies are also common forms of evidence used to persuade us to believe the speaker or writer's conclusion. Analogies compare two seemingly similar things, and this can lead to the faulty analogy fallacy, which is proposing an analogy that has important dissimilarities. So in your textbook, the authors present the following analogy. As an educator, it is important to weed out problem students early and take care of the problems they present, because one bad egg ruins the omelet. Obviously, we know that one bad egg would indeed ruin an omelet, but the writer wants us to believe that one problem student will negatively influence an entire classroom. We know a lot about omelets and less about the effects of problem students in classrooms. So the author is making an argument by analogy in the hopes that we're going to be swayed to believe that there is little difference between children and eggs. So we have to ask ourselves, do the concept of children and eggs in this scenario have relevant similarities? The answer may be perhaps, but when we ask ourselves about relevant differences, the answer to that question is absolutely. Children and eggs are only very tangentially related concepts in this particular analogy, and obviously as human beings in a dynamic classroom, children and eggs begin to lack all relevancy to each other. They're very dissimilar concepts. So in this case, the writer has proposed an analogy that has important dissimilarities, and so that again is known as the faulty analogy fallacy. When we examine an analogy to see if it's a good piece of evidence to support a conclusion, we must carefully evaluate both the similarities and the differences of the two things that are being compared.